Good afternoon, and welcome again to the Georgia Tech Supply Chain and Logistics Institute monthly webinar. And for those of you who have joined us in the past, you know we try to bring you relevant content for the practitioner. And this year we're going to have a focus and a spotlight on our faculty in SCL who are engaged in applied research. And I am excited to introduce Mathieu Dahan, who I have been excited to see in action over the last couple of years as I've joined the team, does some, frankly, leading global work in this space. For those of you who are logistics and supply chain practitioners and supply chain geeks, as I say, you'll have a lot of fun with this one. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome in Mathieu for a nice talk here. As always, if you've got questions, you can put them in the Q&A and Andy and Sean will keep an eye on them. We'll capture them at the end.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. Thank you very much for the nice introduction and for inviting me for this lunch and learn, and so actually for giving me an excuse to use my French and wish everyone a bon appétit, I guess. So my name is Mathieu Dahan. I'm a faculty at Georgia Tech in ISYE, and I want today to talk a bit about some of the work that my students and I are conducting on emergency logistics and rapid response systems. I'll talk about a couple of projects that are conducted with my students, Bishamon, Hayden, and Bobak. So to give a bit of a bit of motivation, I mean, we all know that our distribution networks, whether they are like power systems, like our energy distribution network in general, and supply chains, they are subject to disruptions. We know how easily our power grid can be impacted by bad weather. Last in date was like, for example, the how like the ice buildup would end up breaking some trees that would fall on the power lines. But on top of it, we know that our supply chains are also impacted. They were impacted by COVID. That was the main thing that we noticed over the past years. But on top of it, they are also impacted by intentional disruptions. We know that we have some, for example, cyber physical attacks that are impacting some of our supply chains and costing a lot of money to supply chain companies. But if you also look at non-commercial settings, for example, like in military settings, for example, like during an active conflict, we know how supply lines are important, but also in humanitarian settings. We know how humanitarian logistics, they are increasingly subject to acts of piracy, and then we want to account for it when we try to operate our supply chain. So if you are an operator of a supply chain, then one thing that you also have to account for is that on top of it, your system can also be used to conduct illegal activity. And one of the main acts of illegal activity is going to be smuggling drugs and illegal weapons, for instance. So smugglers are getting more smarter and smarter in smuggling those illegal commodities inside containers. And the goal is to, as security agencies, to be able to detect those illegal commodities. So if you own, for example, like a logistics company or a supply chain, and like you are interested in, well, how can we improve that security and resilience of that network? And it turns out that there are multiple ways to do that. There are multiple levers that you can pull to try to improve that security and resilience based on the information that you have. So using your favorite analytics tool, you can get some information on like past disasters, or for example, like how when a supplier ran out of supply. And then with that information, you can already start to think about like how can you design your network better? So for example, if you were to build a different facility, you want to understand where you should actually build it in order to increase the resilience of your system. Those are long-term decisions, but also you can be thinking about, well, when you start creating contracts with your stakeholders and when you're about to hire labor, you want to determine, like, I know there is going to be some variability over the next few months. How can I make that better decision to improve resilience at this stage? And then, of course, you have the day-to-day operations. So when you're trying to create your route, for example, to ship your commodities, you want to figure out like how to account for it, knowing that maybe there is going to be really bad weather that is going to create some flooding at some. So you see that all of the decisions that I just talked about actually occur before disruptions actually occur. And then the question is, what happens when that disruption actually occurs? For example, the hurricane hits, and now, oh, you have an attack from an enemy, and you want to figure out first. What's very important is that you want to gather intelligence. You want to understand, well, how much information can you actually grasp on that disruption, especially localizing it in order to better respond and more efficiently respond and recover from those disruptions. Similar thing happens, for example, when you try to figure out when one of your suppliers is going to face an issue in their facilities, and you want to make sure to get that information as fast as possible to better respond after that. So that's the framework that I wanted to present here, and I'm going to talk about two projects in particular that my group and I are working on, which is going to be on operational decisions, but also on detecting disruptions. So the first project that I actually wanted to share with you is on expeditionary logistics. So it's actually really focusing on this movement of supplies and personnel to support military operations in challenging environments. And that encompasses quite a few settings. So we're talking about, for example, during a military conflict, you want to be able to deploy your supply lines rapidly. But also, for example, when you're trying to help a community that is impacted by a disaster, you want to be able to deliver these relief supplies fast. On the other hand, you can imagine of the other side of the logistics, which is what if, for example, you have an unsafe area and you want to evacuate refugees or wounded soldiers in a fast way. So we're talking about these settings there, and we see that actually the features are going to be quite different from what we're used to in commercial settings. So for example, in expedition logistics, the goal will be to meet demand as much as possible and on time. So you want to be able to meet as much of that demand on time. And one of the things to keep in mind is that typically you're going to have some demand locations that are actually going to be remote in some quite complicated areas with not necessarily a lot of infrastructure, and that will be far from where your supply is. And the idea is that in order to ship those supplies to meet that demand, you're going to have access to a certain fleet, to a specialized fleet that is going to be multimodal. We're talking about different aircrafts, like ships, or for example, like a vehicle, like ground vehicles, or even trains. And you see that they're not necessarily going to be able to access all your locations directly. And what's important is that you're not going to be able to outsource vehicles elsewhere. In a commercial setting, you're going to have access to a spot market in order to hire more carriers if need be. In this particular case, you're not going to be able to. So you have a dedicated fleet that you have to manage very carefully in order to satisfy that demand. So I think it's a good place to think about like what's currently done, what is the status quo, and what are the current practices. And so this is a project that is connected actually with the U.S. Marine Corps, and so it was very important for us to understand like how the decisions currently made. It turns out that primarily they made using war games and tabletop exercises. When they create their plans, they're going to spend like weeks preparing such exercises, and then they're going to let it run. They're going to simulate it with people making decisions on those tabletop exercises. So really, we're talking about board games there. And on top of it, and then the results, the way that they're presented is using spreadsheets or PowerPoints, and you can see that they're going to be presented at a more high level, in a more high level way. So what this means that you're not necessarily going to have a very quantitative evaluation of your logistics capabilities. So the main question that then we're trying to answer with this type of project is, well, how can we efficiently develop those logistics consolidation plans in those complicated expeditionary environments? And our work in this case with the US Marine Corps was to really formulate and implement a new optimization model for this multimodal scheduled service network design problem. So this logistics planning problem, we want to formulate it using optimization. And then we're going to want to develop a large-scale optimization algorithm to be able to solve it. We have an optimization problem. We want to be able to to solve it for large problems, and we want to be able to efficiently manage our transportation assets. Of course, we're going to validate it. I'm going to show you some of the results on instances that were developed with logisticians at the US Marine Corps. And what's important is that we wanted to go beyond that and integrate that model and that software into their current capabilities. Okay, so let's talk about the problem here, and in particular, like we're going to try to create an abstraction of that problem, and it's going to start with a network that is going to represent our theater, where we're going to have a set of locations and a set of arcs that can be taken by the vehicles. And what's important that you're going to have a set of commodities. So we're talking about different type of commodities. They can be, for example, like relief items of food in humanitarian settings, or they could be ammunition during an active conflict. Those will have different characteristics, and they're going to be located in some areas of your network. And then what's important is that you're going to have some requests that are going to come throughout your horizon, let's say over the next 2 weeks. And that means you need to ship your commodities from the top, let's say, to the bottom. And the way to do this is using some vehicles, different vehicles that are going to have very different characteristics. We're talking about aircrafts are going to be significantly faster than ships, but the ships are going to have way more capacity. So we want to understand what is the right trade-off there. How can we best use them in our problem? So what's important is that because time is of the essence, we're really going to have to make sure that we determine those dispatch times for those vehicles, and we're going to have to model those temporal decisions. And for that, we're going to need to construct a time-space network. Good news is that there is no general relativity there, no complex like physics there, but we're still going to need that temporal dimension in our problem. For that, what we're going to do is that we're going to take our geographical network and we're going to make copies of it for different decision points. And we're going to have, so for example, every hour, we're going to want to make a decision and we want to see the state of our system at every hour. We're going to duplicate our geographical network over these hours. And then we're going to try to model the interactions over the different, across the time. For example, we're going to include some horizontal arcs to tell us where we're going to have some commodities that are going to wait from 1 hour to the next at that location. But most importantly, what we're interested in is what happens when now they're starting to be carried by different vehicles. For example, they could be taken by an aircraft that's going to leave this location to go to this one. It's going to take an hour. However, if we were to take a train to go from this location to that one, it might take 2 hours to transport our commodities. But thanks to this time-space network, we're able to account for all these temporal aspects, and we can now determine our logistic plan on this system. So that's what we're trying to do. And the good news is that now that we have this whole framework, we can start to formulate this decision problem using an optimization model. So now we're talking about mixed integer programming formulation, and that also gives me the excuse to introduce a bit of math because I am one of those math geeks. And on top of it, I want to acknowledge some of my previous students who are in the attendees, and they cannot see a presentation from me without some optimization model. So I want to show a bit like how we can translate this decision problem using optimization, and I'm still going to describe with words what it means. But this type of problem, what we want to do is that we want to determine how we're going to route our vehicles and how we're going to route our commodities inside the vehicles. And what we're going to want to do in the end is that we're going to want to make that decision so that we maximize the value of on-time demand fulfillment. We want to make sure we satisfy as much of the demand on time. And then, in order to do this, we're now going to need to model constraints that will represent the physics of the system. So we want to make sure we're going to have flow balance constraints and make sure that we create a route for our vehicles and make sure that our vehicles don't just teleport from one place to the next. Similarly, for the commodities, we want to make sure that every time that we transport a commodity from A to B, we have enough vehicle capacity to be able to transport those commodities. And again, we want to make sure that our commodities do not teleport from one place to the next. And that's it. Now we actually have an optimization model that is going to give us this language to code it into the computer, and then we can use the power of the computer to solve this complex problem. So one thing I need to talk about before we try to code it and ask the computer to give us the optimal solution is to think about the complexity of the problem. So it turns out that the performance of your logistics will be really impacted by the granularity of the time discretization. Take the example where here you can only make decisions every 6 hours. You can only have departures, let's say every 6 hours, and you have an airplane that can. You're trying to feel send some commodities from the gray area to the yellow area over there. But your plane needs to make a pit stop, let's say in that white location, to let's say to be able to refuel and to be before going to the orange area. You make decisions every 6 hours, then in this particular case, you're not going to be able to satisfy your demand on time. And like you're going to depart at the midnight, and then you're going to ship your commodities to the white location, and then you're not going to be able to schedule your departure again. However, if now it turns out that you now consider like a way more granular way of making decisions, like you're going to allow departures to happen every 2 hours, and it turns out that it takes 2 hours to go from one place to the next, then in this particular case, you can imagine that your plane is going to depart at midnight, is going to be able to refuel and be ready to be dispatched again at 0200 in order to reach our final destination by 0400, in which case you can satisfy the demand. So you can see that there is going to be some trade-off there. It seems that it's important to be able to make those decisions like every 2 hours and like in a more granular way. And if you do this, you're going to be able to better manage your assets. You're going to be able to satisfy more of the deliveries. But the main issue is that the number of decisions is going to explode. You're going to have a problem that is significantly harder to solve. So what I want to present here is that how do we usually handle these type of problems, where in this case you want something that is like quite complex to be able to make better decisions, but unfortunately it's going to be hard to solve. And that's when we can use the class of algorithm called like dynamic discretization in order to get to our desired answer. And the way that these algorithms work is that the idea is that we're going to solve the problem iteratively. We cannot solve the much more larger problem directly. So what we're going to do is that we're going to solve a much simpler problem. So we're going to take, let's say, a coarse time-space network where we make decision every 6 hours. And then we iteratively going to make our problem more complicated. And hopefully, when we do this, if we do it in a smart way, we're going to be able to get to the final answer without having a problem that is too complicated to solve. So if I show you with an example here is that maybe we start with a coarse time-space network over here, and then we solve our problem on that time-space network, and we find that solution that is over here. It's not a good solution. We'll not be able to satisfy the demand. However, if we use a bit of machinery there, we can identify a location, a time-space location that we're interested in. Maybe this one is important to consider it at 0400. We can refine our time-space network, and then we can resolve our optimization problem over there. If that's the case, then we end up with a problem where we can satisfy the demand, but you can see that the time-space network I have here is still much smaller than what it could be. If I'm able to find our optimal solution, then I can return it and I can end this algorithm. And that helps us solve much more complicated problem by solving multiple smaller problems. So that's on the algorithmic side, but I think what's interesting is that how does it work in practice? Here, I want to show you a bit some more results that were on instances that were scenarios that were validated by the U.S. Marine Corps. So here we're talking about three main scenarios that are about training exercises, whether they are in Southern California, Okinawa, or the Bahamas. And you can see that those are actually quite large instances in the sense that we're talking about up to 17 million units that are being requested in some of the locations. We're trying to coordinate up to, let's say, 95 vehicles. And for that, we're going to have up to 57 commodity types that we have to actually transport. So those are like really large problems that they actually encounter in practice. And we want to be able to solve our problems on those instances. What I want to show you here is that what happens when we apply the algorithm that we develop, and we compare it with a direct implementation of, let's say, the mixed integer program that you would solve directly using an optimization solver, such as Gurobi. And we're going to show the results across the different scenarios. And what I'm showing you is that what happens when you solve the same problem with different levels of discretization. What if you make decisions every 6 hours, or if you make them every 3 hours, all the way to if you make decisions every minute. So we're talking about continuous time where we like every minute you make a decision. And here I'm showing you in this graph like how much of the demand are you able to satisfy. So what's interesting in this type of graph is that if you look at Groby, which is like using an optimization software to solve the mixed integer program directly, it's able to solve the problems when you have very coarse time discretization, meaning you make decisions every 6 hours, quite well. However, as soon as you try to make more synchronized decision when you're going to be making them every hour or every minute, it turns out the solver is not capable of getting you any solution there. It runs out of memory very quickly, and you're not going to be able to get any solution that you can leverage in practice. However, in our case, we're still able to solve them, and we're able to solve them with our algorithm, and we can improve, in fact, the fulfillment compared to what you would be doing if you were to only consider very coarse decisions. So here, if you look at the Bahamas, for instance, like making decision every minute, you are able to close to double the amount of demand that you're going to be satisfied as if you were to make those decisions every 6 hours. So overall, like what we see here is that with our methods, we are actually capable of solving the problems close to optimality. On average, it was like 16%, but we were able to solve some of them like really to optimality. But what's important from like a practical impact is that using these type of methods, you can increase the fulfillment of your demand by 100%. So you can clearly double the amount of demand that you can actually satisfy. So this is a bit of like what I wanted to present to you for this part is really like how we can use these algorithmic technique to be able to solve those problems at scale. But I want to go beyond that and say like, okay, then we're able to solve those problems and like, how can it help us? And what are some of the insights that we can derive from them? So here, what I'm showing in this plot there is like, I want to show you the complexity of the logistics plans that we create with those models. What we have here is that I'm showing you for every commodity that are being aggregated as to whether they are being requested early in the time horizon, so let's say over the first third, whether it's in the middle or towards the end. And I want to compute in the end how many vehicles were they on. Was it just direct shipment from the origin to the destination, or did I need to like have a transshipment where I would unload and then load it again? And what we see there is that for these type of problems, where again, time is of the essence. If you have some commodities that are being requested very early on, then those would tend to try to go direct. They're going to be put on vehicles with a very high speed. So here we're talking about like aircrafts, and then they tend to go directly to the destination. However, while those vehicles that are fast are being used, then other commodities, the ones that are being requested later in the time horizon, are being put on some on some slower vehicles in order to be put closer to their demand locations. And this way, we end up with some very complex logistic plan where you see some commodities may require 4 or 5 even different vehicles in order to reach their destinations. So to give you an example of like those are plans that are typically made by hand. And now with optimization, we are able to make much more complex logistics plans by leveraging the power of optimization. So all of this that I talked about, it turns out that actually it's being put into practice, and we are collaborating with a lot of people from the Office of Naval Research and a lot of military contractors to be able to put this tool into production. So now there is actually a tool that is called Vital BMA, where now logisticians are able of creating their own instances on a GUI. They're able to run the optimization model, and then they can see how the logistic plan performs. They have a lot of like KPIs, a lot of metrics where they can see how, for example, how utilized a certain vehicle is going to be. And that helps you determine like how risky that vehicle is, because as soon as it breaks down, the impact of it is going to be quite important. But speaking of risk, that's actually something that we're really interested in. So everything that I've talked about is about assuming everything goes well. We have some demand that we're trying to satisfy, and we have some vehicles that are available and are ready to be dispatched. But in practice, we know that expeditionary logistics are facing like a lot of uncertainties. So here we're talking about, well, there can be a hurricane that is going to pass, or really like a bad weather that is going to create delays. It can also be the case that one of these vehicles is going to require some maintenance and will be delayed by 6 or 12 hours, for instance. And on top of it, when you're looking at expeditionary settings, it's even more likely that you're going to have some enemy presence. So here we're talking actually of contested logistics. And if that's the case, you're going to have some areas you're going to want to avoid, or you know that if you go there, you're more likely to face some enemy attack. So the issue is that you can see that there are many different forms of uncertainties. There are different potential disruptions, and the question is, how can we actually account for all of those when we make our decisions? So here, what we're also interested in on top of it is, well, like, how can we actually evaluate and mitigate this impact of those unplanned disruptions that affect logistics plans? And the way that we're currently doing it as part of this project is using simulation. Simulation is a very good tool to be able to account for a lot of different scenarios. So a lot of what if scenarios where we can then let the computer run the logistic plan with different possible disruptions. So in this particular case, what we have here is that you start with a logistic plan that is being created by the optimization solver that we just talked about. And then we're going to consider many different risk scenarios. So those can be weather-based, or they can be a vehicle that is going to break down. And what's important is that we're going to gather all of that data, those like weather data from the past. We have a lot of data that was gathered over the past 30 years. And we know that in this area, for example, during summer, it is more likely that you're going to have, let's say, a typhoon. And what's going to happen is using this past data, we're going to be able to run the logistic plan, simulate it, assuming that it was scheduled to depart at 0200, so it's going to depart there. And then we're going to determine, well, how much time did it take to actually go from A to B? Maybe the weather was not bad and you were able to cross this area very easily. But maybe actually there is heavy rain, the waves, for example, are quite higher. And as a result, you need to take some detour. And now it's going to take you 45 more minutes to go from A to B. We're able to simulate that impact of this bad scenario on your logistic plan, and then we can gather that the performance of the logistic plan under each scenario. You can gather all of this, and now you have some metrics of performance that you can analyze. So the benefit of all of this is that now you do have this quantitative tool to estimate the impact of risks on logistics plans. So you can determine for each location, well, maybe you were hoping to satisfy 100% of that demand, of that purple demand, but instead it's only going to be 50% on average. And you can even have a distribution across your scenarios. But you can go beyond that. It's good to understand like what are the risks, but you want to understand why. In particular, you want to be able to identify what are the bottlenecks of your logistic plan. What were the vehicles that were the most impacted, the most vulnerable to, for example, those disruptions due to weather? So now you have this tool that helps you determine which vehicle is the most impacted and which one potentially that you want to reinforce or protect to be able to mitigate the impact of the risk. And because at the end, what we want is to be able to create different plans, different logistic plans that are going to be more resilient and more risk aware. From there, then you can have a plan that is going to be a bit more conservative and that maybe hopefully is going to perform better. So that's actually everything that I wanted to cover for this first project, which is really like how we can use optimization and simulation to try to design multimodal expedition logistics and estimate its risk of delays and disruptions. In order to solve those large problems, we saw that It's a large problem. It's a very complicated problem to solve at once. So instead, we're going to solve multiple smaller problems in order to get to a good solution in the end. And we are able to get to double the amount of demand that we can satisfy compared to benchmark methods, and those we can actually validate them using instances created by the US Marine Corps. So that's everything that I wanted to cover now. And now I want to shift gears a bit because we talked about operational decisions now, and I want to talk about a different set of projects and a different set of tools that we can use to improve resilience, especially when after the disruptions occur, or especially when after an illegal activity is being conducted. So to give a bit more motivation there, so here we're talking about inspecting distribution networks. Distribution networks that are either, for example, attacked by an adversary or being utilized to conduct illegal activity. For example, smuggling illegal goods. And what we want to do as inspectors or security agencies is to be able to use inspection resources such as X-ray scanners. We're talking about canine units. We want to be able to better to use them in order to detect that illegal activity. But the main challenge that security agencies face in this case is that, well, we know that those detection resources are not necessarily perfect. We don't necessarily have all of the information about the adversary that we face. And unfortunately, we don't have enough resources to be able to inspect and protect our whole system at once. That from there, what we want to use is techniques from like analytics and operational research to be able to coordinate efficiently those inspection resources in order to detect that illegal activity, even though we face some uncertainty regarding it. And what's interesting is that this type of problem is actually quite different from what we talked about. What we talked about in the past, it was an optimization trying to find the best answer. But now this type of problem is actually quite different because now if I'm the inspector, I'm going to be playing against an adversary. And all of a sudden, this becomes a game. I guess I'm still a bit of a kid at heart, and I was interested in those games, in trying to be able to solve them. So what we're going to be doing is really so we're going to be borrowing concepts from economics in order to, say, especially from game theory, to be able to understand how I, as the inspector, I should be behaving, and how the adversary also is going to behave as well if they were to be rational. That's why we're going to be considering what we call a zero-sum game, and where we're going to see like how we can allocate our different heterogeneous resources, how we can create a schedule of our inspection operations, and knowing that we still face some uncertainty regarding our adversaries. And what we're doing there is that we're really going to see like, well, this is still going to be a very complicated problem, but it turns out this is a nice one where we can try to use our brains actually to try to understand what's happening under the hood. And we're going to be able to develop formulas to be able to understand how I should behave, how the opponent should behave. And then it's going to help us determine, well, how should I acquire, for example, inspection resources? We can use this information to determine, well, in the end, on a tactical level, more tactical level, which type of resources are better to invest on. Are we talking about X-ray scanners, canine units? And we're going to be able to answer this question thanks to the analysis that we derive. And then we're going to validate everything using data from US ports. Good. So in this type of problem, as I mentioned, so it is going to be quite different. So here we're talking about a system where we have different locations. So you can imagine that those locations are containers where they potentially have different capacities of storing illegal commodities. And what's important is that in those containers or those locations, the adversary is going to hide illegal resources. And those illegal resources might have different damage values. So here we're talking about some illegal resources might be more important. It might be, for example, like a bomb, for example, versus for example, you see like cocaine. Those are going to have maybe different monetary values, or they're going to have different societal impacts. But at the same time, we're going to have an inspector who will have different inspection resources. So here we're talking about those X-ray scanners, canine units, and we know that they're going to have different detection accuracies. So we're going to model them using probabilities. And what's going to be important is that, for example, I, as the inspector, I'm not necessarily going to know which adversary I'm actually going to face. It might be the case that today I'm going to face an adversary who is hiding three different illegal resources in the containers. But it might be the case that they're only hiding two. And I will assume that I only know with some probability what type of adversary I face. And similarly, the adversary is only going to know with some probability what type of an inspector they face. You can imagine that a smuggler, when they start smuggling they start shipping the illegal commodities from their point of origin, they don't necessarily know exactly what type of inspector they are going to face once they arrive, for example, in the US. We can model this uncertainty and account it into the model. But at the end, like what we're trying to do is that if I'm the inspector, I'm going to want to maximize this expected damage value of detected illegal resources. I want to be able to detect the illegal resources and really maximize that damage value of the illegal resources that I can detect. Of course, at the same time, if I'm the adversary, I'm going to try to minimize that. I want to make sure that as little illegal resources as possible would get detected. And that's really the game that is being played in this case. And the goal is, well, how can we formulate it and how can we solve it? So in order to do this, what we do is that we formulate what's called a zero-sum game, where now we are allowing each player to select a probability distribution over their allocation plans. What that means is that, for example, if I'm the inspector, maybe today I'm going to place an inspection resource on the left container. But it might be the case that tomorrow I'm going to be placing it there. It might be the case that every day I'm going to throw a coin, and based on like whether it falls on the heads or tail, I'm going to go left or right. And that's going to be a probability distribution. And that can be translated into a schedule of operations like every day or every week. At the same time, you have the adversary that, for example, is going to randomize the placement of the illegal resources within the containers. Maybe today they are actually hiding those two resources there, but maybe tomorrow they're going to place them all on the left container. So based on that, those probability distributions, now what we're going to be interested in will be this expected payoff, which is the expected illegal resources that will be detected. And that is the quantity that the inspector wants to maximize and that the adversary wants to minimize. But here I want to stop here for a second and try to point you towards something is that in regular optimization, we're trying to maximize an objective. It's a single objective, we're trying to find the best option. But now we have conflicting objectives. As an inspector, I'm trying to maximize something that at the same time the adversary is going to try to minimize it. And it turns out that when that happens, when you're in those situations, the social concept that we're interested in, and that comes from game theory and from economics, is the notion of equilibrium, especially of Nash equilibrium. And what this means is that if I choose an action and the other players choose an action, I want to make sure that I'm in an equilibrium and that no player has an incentive to deviate from their strategy. Meaning that, for example, if I'm here and I chose this strategy as the inspector, sigma 1, sigma I star, and the adversary chose sigma A star, then if I were to deviate and I were to switch to a different strategy, I am going to do worse. Meaning I am going to detect less of the illegal resources. And that actually is the concept. So that's what we want to be able to solve in this particular case. And the goal, again, is well, how can we compute Nash equilibria for this large game? There are many different actions. There are many different ways of creating a strategy. We face some uncertainty regarding the opponent. And for that, we want to be able to find the best action there. In this case, the best equilibrium. So it turns out that it's a very interesting problem, and sometimes we can use algorithmic tools to be able to get to the answers, but sometimes we try to use as much of our insights as possible to try to solve those problems. And that helps us solve them fast. So here what I want to do is actually, as I mentioned, it's a game, and so we're going to be actually going into some cases and understanding what happens and try to guess what I should be doing and what would the opponent be doing. So in this particular case, I'm going to be considering the case where the adversary is going to allocate the most critical resources to the smallest location. So imagine those are going to be the worst resources, the ones that are going to have the highest damage, while those over here are the ones that are going to have the least damage. And what we're going to assume is that by doing so, if the adversary does this, then the expected damage value in each location is going to have this nice distribution. If I were to sum up all of those damage values, I'm still going to have a higher level of damage values hidden in that first container as opposed to in this last container. So that's what I'm going to consider as a first case. And now I want to understand, if I see this and I'm the inspector, what should I be doing? And it turns out that in this particular case, I should be allocating my best inspection resources, my best resources, the one that has the highest accuracy, to the ones on the left. I know that if I know that there is going to be more damage value to detect there, then I need to make sure that I have my best sensor over here. On the other hand, if I have a less amount of damage value in total there, maybe I'm going to put my worst sensor over there. If you do this, actually, you can prove very easily that you are at that desired equilibrium. It turns out that if you were to swap those strategies, those actions, for example, instead that best sensor, I would want to put it into the last one instead, automatically you're going to detect less of that damage value. And same for the adversary. They would not want to deviate from that. It turns out that in this simple case, we can very easily prove that we are at an equilibrium and we don't have to do anything else. Of course, that was a very special case where we have a nice property, but in general, that's not going to be true. If the adversary were to stick to this action that we talked about, it might be the case that the distribution of the damage value in each location might be much more complicated. But this is a case where we can leverage the insights that we've developed for the special case to help us solve the more general one. And in particular, what we're going to want to do if we were to be the adversary is that now we're going to start randomizing the allocation of our illegal resources in order to try to find again this nice this nice shape in the expected damage values in each location. What I mean by that is that if you look at the last ones over here, this doesn't have the right direction, the nice shape that we were interested in. So what we're going to be doing is that we're going to start randomizing, meaning it might be the case that today I put this resource over here, this dark brown resource here, but tomorrow I'm going to put it there. So that's when we're going to start randomizing. And we're going to randomize in a way that now the expected damage value in each location is actually going to be equal across those locations. And now as the adversary, I can repeat this process again and again. And if I do this, then I can find a way of randomizing the resources so that we find again this nice shape, this nice relationship between the damage values that we have there. What we have in the end is that we have different zones. And now as the inspector, what I would want to do is very similar insight to what we had before is that we want to place our best inspection resources where there is the most damage value to detect. And then I'm going to want to put my worst inspection resources where there's going to be the least amount of damage values to detect. And we can prove that it is actually a nice equilibrium and everything works well. So that's more on the more complex side, but I really want to see like what is the value of everything we just talked about. Like we try to use our intuition to try to solve actually the game exactly. And if you do this, you can compute mathematically what is going to be the payoff for the players, meaning what is going to be the expected damage value of the detected illegal items. And actually you can write it in a math expression that is there. Don't stare at it too much because it's, at least if I do that, it gives me nightmares afterwards. But from these, what we can show is that we can get a lot of insight regarding our problem. In the end, if I'm the inspector or the security agency, I want to get some insights as to like, what should a rational adversary do? Similarly, like in the end, what should be my policy that I should implement to be able to be as optimal as possible? And what we see some interesting things there. Here from the solution, what we find is that while we actually, as the inspector, we're kind of sacrificing these illegal resources that actually are the worst. Imagine those were the ones with the highest, themselves are the highest damage values. Here we're talking about, like, let's say the bomb, for instance. And those are the ones where we're going to put our worst detectors over here. On the other hand, and we do this so that at least we detect more of the less valuable, the less critical illegal resources. But at the same time, we see that what the adversary does, and the adversary in this case is actually quite smart, is that what they're doing is that they're actually allocating the less valuable resources in those larger locations to incentivize the inspector to actually detect and to inspect these particular containers. And this way, so you can really view them as sort of like decoys that are being used so that at least those worst illegal resources can go through undetected. And that's actually quite related to what's actually happening in practice in all sorts of like smuggling situations. One thing that actually I want to also mention is that it's quite interesting from this analysis is that it turns out that the decision of the adversary does not even depend on the inspection and the inspector's resources. It doesn't matter whether the inspector has like 3 K9 units or only one, and then X-ray scanners, for instance. The adversary is the best course of action is to do the same randomization. What that means, and I think that's the part that is actually quite interesting, is that if you are the inspector and you're trying to determine, well, should I try to conceal my inspection resources? Should I try to hide how many, what type of inspection resources I have? Would I get strategic advantage if I were to do this? What this analysis is telling you is that actually not really, because in the end, the adversary is still going to be doing the same thing. So there is no advantage from concealing your inspection resources, which is actually quite interesting, and we can develop thanks to the analysis that we derived. So from all of this, what we have is that what we want to do is that, okay, we've developed all this analysis on what is the best way to allocate our inspection resources. But now what we wanted to do is to understand, well, from this analysis, what would be the best inspection resources that we should purchase? If I now were to be given a budget and I know the cost of purchasing different types of resources, how should I allocate this budget? And especially knowing that I'm going to face some uncertainty regarding my adversary. I don't know if over the next year I'm going to be facing this adversary with, let's say, this type of resources, or this adversary with this type of resources. So what we do is that you can embed this problem. It's now a two-stage problem where you see you make decisions at two different levels. First, you acquire your resources, and then you allocate them across your ports to detect the smuggled resources. And it turns out that thanks to all of the analysis that we developed, even if it's a very complicated problem in itself, we can actually reduce it to a very simple integer program. So it's called a knapsack problem, but it's a very simple one that we can solve it very efficiently. But enough about like the optimization. What I really want to see is like, okay, how does everything I just talked about apply to a case study, a real case study, which is about seizing illegal drugs, for example, in the US by inspecting containers at ports. So here we have like two different case studies that are like for the ports in Florida and the ports in California. And here, what we gather a lot of data that is publicly available, for example, regarding the number of containers that actually that are arriving at each port per week. And then we also get information on the drugs that were seized over the past years. And also we get access to the average selling price of these resources. On top of it, we try to get some data regarding the accuracy of detection of the different inspection resources that we also utilize. And then we run our study. So what's important is that what we wanted to understand is that how important is the value of intelligence? How important is it for me as the inspector to know about my adversary? What we do is that we conduct this analysis using historical data for different adversary types. So we're talking about like different adversaries where for 1 month, maybe we had 100 kilograms of cocaine that went through, but then another month it was 300 kilograms. So we gather this data, and then that gives us probabilities that maybe next month we're going to have 100 kilograms or it's going to be 300 kilograms. And then we repeat this process like a million times, and then we determine for each of them what is the uncertainty that I was currently facing, and how well do I perform as the inspector? And then we show the results. So here in this particular graph for that is for California, what is happening on the x-axis is that we're talking about like the million different instances that we computed, where we stratified them based on the level of uncertainty that I was facing. So in this particular case, if I'm there, that means those are the cases where I face a lot of uncertainty regarding my adversary. I don't know if next month is going to be 100 kilograms or 300 kilograms. On the other hand, if we look at the far left side, those are cases where I know fairly with a fairly high probability or fairly certain that I'm going to know that 100 kilograms of cocaine are going to come next month. And we can see that when you solve the problem, you determine how to allocate your inspection resources, you can perform significantly better as you get more information regarding the adversary. And quantitatively, what we find here is that there is an increase in $20 million of in seized drugs that you can obtain simply by gathering adversarial intelligence and leveraging it into your decision on like how to allocate your resources. And so that's actually quite good news. But what I really want even to go beyond is to understand in particular, like what are the type of inspection resources that I should acquire, for example, whether I'm in California or I'm in Florida. And especially, how does it depend on the information that I have regarding my adversary? If you look, for example, in Florida over there, so we're looking at the orange bars over there. So this is telling us again, I have more uncertainty regarding my adversary. I have less over here. What I'm looking at is what is the average cost of acquired inspection resources? Meaning, should I acquire cheaper resources that are going to have like a less detection capabilities, but then I can purchase more of those? Or should I instead acquire a single inspection resource that is perfect, that is going to work much better, but of course that is going to cost more? What's very interesting is that this purchasing pattern highly depends on the information that you have regarding your opponent. If you don't, in Florida, for instance, if you don't know what type of adversary you're going to face, then what you're going to want to purchase is instead, it's a lot of cheap detectors. If you do this, what's going to happen is that you're going to be able to allocate them throughout the ports in Florida, and you're going to be able to detect more of the illegal items. However, as you gather more intelligence, so you move towards this side over here, then you know that you're going to want to specialize more. Maybe this particular location is going to be in Florida is going to be more important. So then it's better for me to have a better inspection resource, one that has higher detection accuracy, to be able to allocate there and then detect more of those. What's actually quite interesting is that if you look at this trend, it's actually different in California. In California over there, if you face a lot of uncertainty, you're going to want instead to hire a small number of very expensive resources. And the reason behind this is that in California, the volume of containers was very heterogeneous across the ports. Maybe there was one port that receives a lot of containers, while there are a lot of ports that receive a small number of containers. And if that's the case, then you want to make sure that you have a very good inspection resource to allocate in that very big port to be able to detect resources, because you don't know in the end what type of like, adversary you're going to face. However, as you gather more intelligence, then you're going to want to be a bit more careful in terms of like how you're going to want to diversify your portfolio of inspection resources, and you get something that is a bit more diverse over here. So what I want to give you over there is that gathering intelligence is very important, but then you see that it's going to lead to very different decisions based on your setting, based on where you are. So that's everything that I wanted to cover today. So here in particular for this second project, I really want to tell you like how you can borrow tools from game theory or from economics to try to find the best decisions that you're going to make as an inspector, understanding the best decision for the adversary. We can use our brain to try to understand like what is the best way to behave, and in order to get like the best way of allocating our inspection resources, what is the best way of acquiring them. And then we can see with a case study, like in the end, like how important is the intelligence that you can gather regarding your adversary. So That's everything I wanted to talk to you about. So you can see that this framework of like resilience is actually important and quite ubiquitous. You can apply it to many different settings, like that. For example, my sister and are working on. Now we use all tools in AI, whether we're talking about like optimization, game theory, machine learning, or simulation, to try to improve the resilience of those networks, have better rapid response systems. And that's everything that I wanted to cover for today. So with that, I think I will close it here and thank you very much for your attention.
Superb. Thank you, Mathieu. We actually have two questions, and I'll see how easy you can handle the first one, and we'll see if we can get the second one. So the first one is from Angel Syed, and the verbatim, the case for optimization is very clear. With respect to limitations in computational power, how long does it take currently to run one of these optimization? Is it something that must happen on the cloud? Can it happen on a laptop? I hear about the rise of quantum-like optimization algorithms running on classical computers. What are the cases in which this is recommended or required? Is this category a huge challenge or a more pressing challenge is adjusting to smaller scale last-minute optimization problems? So that's a mouthful.
Down, but that's a great question. And actually, it's really relevant to some of the challenges that we face. So first question is that those algorithms, they were run over like an hour. So an hour on our computers and all the servers that we have inside the department. But however, we can run them on the computer. So the good news is that we wanted to solve them fast, and that was the motivation for it. Is that in practice, when we're talking about like with military logisticians, they want to be able to compare multiple logistics plans. They want to be able to change them as they adjust their courses of action. As a result, what they want is to be able to get a solution quickly and a good solution quickly. So, and the second thing is that they want to be able to run those algorithms on the field. So here we're talking like using like a personal laptop where you don't necessarily have connectivity to the internet and you want to be able to run them. So that's why it was actually quite important and a motivation for us to be able to run those optimization fast. I think that's the main answer to this question. And of course, quantum computing is hopefully going to help more. Here, there is definitely going to be a challenge with accessing like a large quantum computers, but hopefully over the next years, we're definitely going to see how we can leverage them for better
Okay,
solutions.
good. So now I'll go to the second question from Kasreem. How does limited information affect decision making under emergency conditions? What are the follow on to this, two follow ons? What are the most common leadership mistakes during emergency supply chain disruptions? And what does a more resilient response system look like in practice?
That's a very good question, very good and very broad question. So I'll need a second to think about it. So um, limited information in especially in like emergency logistics in general, you can imagine like after a disaster, one of the main sources of uncertainties regarding what are the what are the communities that are impacted, the most impacted. Where is the most demand, for example, for relief items? So in this particular case, like one of the options to try to counteract this limited information is to try to gather that information. And one possibility is that after a disaster, you could spend, for example, a day or two trying to gather as much information as possible and develop predictive models to try to get a better sense as to like what are the communities that are the most impacted. Regarding like what are the most common mistakes that current leaders like in emergency logistics are doing. I won't be able to answer to that because I am an academic and I would not want to speak for actual like practitioners in this sense. What we do see is in particular is there are some challenges in, for example, on the decision side, that everything becomes more myopic, trying to make very short-term decisions without necessarily thinking of the broader sense. But everyone is doing the best that they can, and so like there is nothing bad with that. Did I
Superb.
miss any part of that question, or did I address?
No, I think that's great. Again, I want to thank you so much, Mathieu. For those on this who have friends who would like this reminder, we'll get a link to the recording out that'll be available on YouTube of about 1 week from today, and we'll be happy to share it. We would love for you to share it further. Again, I want to thank those who did attend, and I want to highlight a couple things upcoming. Okay. We've got courses coming over the course of the next few weeks. Our procurement courses, category management, contracting, and essentials of negotiation that will be virtual instructor led. These are very popular courses. We already have a good cohort in these, but if you know folks, these are courses that major Fortune 100 companies use to train their procurement people new. So if you haven't taken these courses, and if you're Georgia resident, we've got nice discounts on these. And if you're not a Georgia resident, these are very modestly priced courses. Okay. So there we are. Georgia AIM is available for Georgia residents through 3/4 of the year. Really get yourself into these courses in the first half of the year to take advantage of these. We're not sure what discounts will look like after August 31st. And then we want to highlight our upcoming Lunch and Learn in March, where we will talk about a very hot topic. I was listening to a podcast on this today, building the electrified supply chain. And Dr. Constance Crozier will be with us there. So please go ahead and grab this 2D barcode and this link and go ahead and sign up right now. We have not yet figured out how to automatically sign you up, so you've got to take the action there. So see that 2D barcode. This will also be available when the link comes out. So we are going to get you out on time. So with that, I will say, please follow us and join us again next month. Thank you so much for joining and have a great day.